crack the problem. In fact, if I'm being 100% honest, the technical difficulties were 100% on Connor. Like it wasn't me at all. Like
Yeah.
anybody who tells you differently, it's just not true. Ignore the fact that now I'm having trouble seeing my own screen. That is not. Oh no, I fixed it. I mean, no problem at all. And I'm here welcoming Connor, aka Counterpoints, on the internet.coms. A few minutes of technical difficulties, totally not my fault. It was somebody else's fault. Somebody came in here, they messed up my computer. But we're going to talk about systemic racism. We're going to talk about a couple of other issues, and we're going to talk about what Connor sees as solutions if hopefully we can agree on problems. Connor, welcome to my channel.
No, thanks for having me, bud. Sincerely appreciated. So, yeah, that's kind of the thing is, I feel like the left and right probably don't agree on descriptions, and we might not be able to. But I was hoping to like strongman kind of the better stuff that I'd heard out of the left because I've been on the panel scene for a really long time doing debates. And then I just wanted to kind of bring those to your attention, see if you could incorporate them into your worldview or not. And that I wouldn't mind hearing any of the pushback or criticisms that you had. And then the other thing too is while from a descriptive standpoint there might be not much agreement, I think there actually are things that like liberals, libertarians, some conservatives, conservatarians, all that kind of stuff could potentially agree with as far as like political solutions to the problems that we see. And that's something that I wanted to talk about because oftentimes these conversations devolve into, my study, your study, debunking, definitions, all that kind of stuff. We don't get very far. And that's kind of why I wanted to have this conversation with you, basically.
Right. And I agree to a certain extent. Like, there is a lot of, like, check out my study and my data and my obscure point, and can you counter it before we can even talk about, like, anything? And, I get that part of it is a tactic. If you're stuck, like, demand something in the moment is produced for you. So that way you can get out of being stuck and not actually address the issue. But
Mhm.
like I have like a fundamental problem with the ideas behind systemic racism or the people who advocate for it or label it a problem. And people are making fun of the way that I said study, but they should be used to it. And it's just I like you gotta give me a you got to give me more than there's a disparity, therefore there's a problem. And I think
Mhm.
people look at disparate outcomes and they say that's the issue, that's the number one issue, that's what we need to address and all that, and I just don't agree with that. I don't understand this premise of why you would expect equal outcome.
Yeah, so I wouldn't like individually would not expect equal outcome, but I think that on the right we kind of talk about like equality of opportunity oftentimes, basically creating equality of opportunity, allowing people to self-actualize in the best ways possible. And I'm not entirely convinced that our systems at this point are allowing people to self-actualize to the maximum degree. Whether or not you want to call it systemic racism or not, I don't. I was kind of telling Rose this the other day. I don't give a fuck what we call it. I just think that we need to acknowledge that we have problems and we need to find some solutions. So just to bring it kind of so we can have like descriptive consensus or whatever. Do you think that we had systemic racism maybe up until like 1964, 1965? Like built into the system, we had racist laws and racist covenants and all that kind of stuff?
I mean, it's not even a matter of whether I think it. We had discriminatory laws on the books. Those definitely existed. I would hope nobody disputes that, but
Hmm.
you never know.
Well, yeah, I'm on the internet, so everybody disputes everything. So, like, so then my logical follow up to this, and I'm not even, by the way, I'm not even saying this is systemic racism. I'm just saying this is like a logical extension of that thought process. So, if black folk were, kind of systemically discriminated up against up until maybe 1965. And then we had, my family's been able to do relatively well despite being of an Irish background because of intergenerational wealth. Both my grandparents were small business owners. They were able to create some equity. They were able to pass on some of that money to my parents. They emphasized education as a necessary part of them coming up. And my parents were able to get college degrees and make a decent amount of money and support me in my academic endeavors. So my success, while obviously the product of my blood, sweat, and tears, was enabled because my grandparents were mildly successful, my parents were mildly successful, and then they were able to pay it forward from a kind of like social support. So do you have any kind of like objections to black people who might say like, hey, listen, up until 1965, we were legally discriminated against. And because of some of these systems that were put in place, both before and after that, my parents and myself, I didn't have the same kind of like intergenerational opportunity that maybe other people have.
I mean, I understand people who make that assertion, but whether or not I buy that is like a whole other thing. Like you would have to first establish to me that discrimination was the reason that their parents were poor. Like we have a long like look at minority groups that have been discriminated against across the world.
Mhm.
There is no such automatic cause that just because the majority group is trying to discriminate against you, therefore you have worse outcome. In fact, we've seen throughout history multiple different discriminated against minority groups do better than the majority group. And in fact, that has usually been the reason for discrimination or increased discrimination. So like I don't buy into the idea that oh, just because your parents like had a better chance, then all of a sudden you can't succeed. You can't get a head start. And I don't believe that all or even most of the position that black Americans find themselves in is due to past discrimination. I think it's due to their actions right now.
Okay. That yeah, that's interesting, and I'd like to respond to that. But when you're talking about like the groups that have come in, that have done better despite discrimination,
No,
um,
no, 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 not groups that have come in. Groups across the world that
mhm,
are discriminated against in various countries, there's
mhm,
plenty of them that outperform the majority group. The Chinese in Malaysia is a perfect example of that. In Malaysia, native Malays get free education. They have
mhm.
quotas in universities, all kinds of other things that advantage them over the Chinese minority, and the Chinese minority outperforms them in every metric that we would consider like an achievement metric.
Okay.
Like
So
despite this.
yeah, sure. So when so let me just kind of explain or what I'm reading into what you're saying, and then you tell me if I'm right or not. So kind of like Jewish folk in Europe obviously had a lot of historical discrimination. Jewish folk in America had a lot of discrimination. Asian folk inside the United States, like you said, Chinese folk who are overseas. And then I think one of the examples that I've heard is, for instance, like Nigerians who come to the United States basically are able to do well despite being part of the discriminated against class or whatever.
No, no, no. So, like
Mhm.
Nigerians, there's no long history of discrimination against Nigerians specifically in Nigeria or here. And the Nigerians that come here are not a discriminated against minority group. I'm not talking about immigration. I'm talking about minority groups within their own country. So, or within the countries that they find themselves in, like Armenians. Pre-Armenian genocide, Armenians were outperforming the majority Turks. And
Mhm.
obviously they weren't in a privileged position because the Turks like committed the Armenian genocide later on.
Mhm.
There are groups in India that do well in Africa, and they do well in India despite the fact that they're considered like the Jews of India. I just forget the name for that. Lebanese people do well outside of Lebanon. Germanic peoples do well in Eastern Europe when they're not the majority. In fact, a bunch of Eastern European cities in Slavic nations are actually founded by Germanic people, and there has been discrimination against them. So I'm not like talking about like Nigerian immigrants that are already educated coming to the United States do better. If you want to talk about immigrant groups, like the West Indians are a good example. These are people with a similar history, transatlantic slave trade. That's why they're brought to the United States. And when they control for all these different metrics, as in like, immigrants, maybe they might be more educated. So they compare them to similarly educated black people. They outperform them. When they control them, they're like, oh, when you move, that proves you're ambitious. And they compare it to domestic black people who recently moved. They outperform them. And I don't think discrimination is the determining factor for these minority groups. I think it's their behavior that is driving them to success or failure.
Okay. Then okay, so that's interesting because basically you said the determining factor is basically behavior, right? And we would see this as what I would guess is a cycle of culture, right? So what people believe, how they conduct themselves, how families are raised, how they value or view education, basically how they participate in the society and all that kind of stuff. So would for me, what I would say is those factors, what we would call culture and how people interact with society, would be pretty malleable over time. Like, do you agree with me that it's malleable, or do you think that it's kind of like fixed?
Yeah, you can change your behavior, and if enough people change their behavior broadly, then that would produce a cultural change. And we've seen this happen before. I have examples of people who changed their behaviors and all of a sudden they had different outcomes.
Okay. And then I think that kind of gets into why conservatives oftentimes appeal to like a more bootstrap mentality, is because obviously we have loads of successful people who basically said, hey, listen, even if the system is rigged, or even if my family says that the system is rigged, I'm going to be as aggressive as I possibly can. I'm going to take my education seriously. I'm going to fucking be as aggressive about every opportunity that's presented me. And as a result, they've achieved like stellar success. Like that's kind of what I see as like the example on the right wing of like what people should do should they find themselves in a disadvantaged circumstance. What I would say, though, is that basically when you're talking about these disadvantaged circumstances, there's particularly for me, as a person whose family was raised in the North, I would view education as one of the main things that like people need to take seriously in order to advance themselves. And what I would say is, while there's a whole bunch of cultural issues, so for instance, like I had a bunch of black friends who I served with in the military who basically talked shit to them about going into the military, talked shit to them about the way they conducted themselves in school, accused them of being like Oreos and fucking, like all sorts of like negative shit, trying to kind of bring them down from their ambitions. But what I would say is that like, I feel like these things can be enabled. And I don't know if we as a society are enabling these things in the proper way.
I mean, like I don't know what you mean by like enabled externally. Like one of my biggest issues is that people keep trying to externalize problems. Like the changes have to be made from within. Like that's going to be my overarching theme for here. So I'll give you a perfect example of this. Germanic Jews established themselves in New York City well before Hungarian Jews moved in. And they were in the Upper West Side. And by the way, the Upper West Side is a really nice part of Manhattan. If you ever visit it, Central Park West, absolutely gorgeous. Couple decades later, a bunch of Hungarian Jews moved into the Bronx, by the way, still a very historic Jewish neighborhood. And they were not behaving in the ways that people were accustomed to. So gains that the Germanic Jews had against like anti-Semitic sentiment were lost due to the behavior of the Hungarian Jews. Now, these Germanic Jews, they had a couple of choices. They could have complained about anti-Semitism, which would have been justified. Just because what you see a group of people acting poorly doesn't mean that you should discriminate against them. I think we both can agree on that. But instead, what they did was they went to these neighborhoods and they helped assimilate them into what is expected of them in American behavior. And I think that that needs to happen because we tend to believe, for some ungodly reason, that you can act completely differently and expect similar outcomes, and that's ridiculous. Like a lot of the negative behaviors that we see in Black culture are Southern behaviors that we did not tolerate when white people were doing them. And when they changed those behaviors, they started succeeding in the South. Like, so I don't think we should like, oh, we need to give them more programs, this, that, or the other, because it's not going to change the internal problems, their behavior, what they bring to the table, more than them changing their own behavior.
Okay, so yeah, this is kind of going to get into like the role of government and intervention and economics and all that kind of stuff. At which point we're probably going to have some disagreement, but I would be interested in exploring this. The reason why, okay, so there's one, to the chagrin of my audience, this is something that I feel like the right wing has fundamentally correct. You create your habits, and then your habits kind of form you. You have to have an investment in your own life, because frankly, like, and I kind of talk shit to lefties about this a little bit. If you're waiting to elect a Bernie Sanders like figure sometime in the next 30 years, you're going to be halfway in the fucking grave by the time your life has passed you by. If you want to be successful, if you want to get your shit together, if you want to take care of your family, if you want to advance your fucking yourself and the people around you that you love and care about, you have to take that upon yourself. You can't be waiting for fucking, some lefty fucking redistributive economic figure to fucking save you, right? right? So I think that's fundamentally correct. But then I do think that there's certain social support systems that we just don't value in the United States of America that don't really make sense. So for instance, I think that like labor force participation rate between like black and white Americans is the difference between it is like 5%. I want to say like American labor force participation rate is like around 70 to 72. I want to say black labor force participation rate is around 65. A decent folk. So that's while a significant difference, it's not enough to like impugn an entire demographic. What I would say is that we have not taken family seriously within the past 50 years of the United States. And there are certain social support systems that are incredibly important, like education, that can kind of give kids a head start. One of the talking points that I hear on the right is that one of the exacerbating factors that destroyed the black family was the welfare system, because it basically incentivized people to not have a married spouse in the home because that upped the income and then therefore made them not eligible for benefits. So this basically incentivized people to have kids without claiming a domestic partner, because then they would be ineligible for benefits for subsistence. This would be an example for me of perverse incentive, where people who need help in order to survive, they need help. And then the only way that you're going to break that next generation out of the welfare system is basically to make them happy, healthy, productive citizens. And there's a whole bunch, for me, like early childhood education is not my forte, but I think a lot of the evidence in early childhood education basically indicates the more aggressive and the more early, the better. The more exposure to more information, the more exposure to reading, writing, mathematics, all that kind of stuff. That's incredibly important for a child's development. So for me, and I know this was long-winded, I hope you can track it, basically what I would say is fiscal conservatives, when we talk about things like, oh, we need to invest in universal pre-K or something like that, the annual price tag for that is $26 billion. And we constantly hear, where's the money going to come from? We hear that shit all the time. And what I would say is, we spent $48 billion in Afghanistan for the past fucking 20 years without blinking. It's 0.03% of the budget. So that's kind of where, for me, unfortunately, the right wing has the bootstrap mentality that they might be like foundationally correct with on an individualistic level, but we're not enabling that success through social support systems. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, so like I have no problem with these ideas in theory, but one of my biggest issues with proposals like universal pre-K, perfect example of this, is that once we do a test, like there was a Head Start program under President Obama's administration, and then we do a study, the results of that study don't matter to the people that are advocating for them. Mm-hmm. So they studied the Head Start program. This was the pilot program for universal healthcare program. And they found out that once you get to the third grade, all the advantages that were gained for the pre-K were lost. We have states that have universal pre-K already. Those states don't have students that outperform the country at all, like let alone dramatically outperform the country. So it's not a matter of like if we can afford it. Obviously, mathematically, if you're going to break it down that way, of course, right? But like we're gonna spend $3 trillion that we're just going to create for an infrastructure bill right now. Like that's what's being debated in reconciliation, and 26 billion compared to that is nothing. But the point is they study this like. It was under the Head Start program. They found out that the academic advantages were lost by the third grade. Like the problems with education, again, are coming from people's homes. Mm-hmm. The reason why Asian kids outperform white kids is because Asian kids spend twice as much time on their homework. The reason why they outperform black kids is because they spend 4 times as much time on their homework. Like you can have universal pre-K, but if you don't have a home that values education, if you have people who think going and getting educated and speaking properly is becoming white and denying your culture, that's not a recipe for success.
Okay, it isn't, and we agree here. But the issue that I have with this, so for instance, like we're looking at what? So Obama was in office for 8 years. Let's say that he passed like Head Start like the first like 8 years or whatever. He basically had it the whole 8 years, and that was like the system. This is a fucking microsecond when it comes to intervention, like when it comes to the effects of policy. We talk about societies. This is me getting a little again, to the chagrin of my audience, this is me getting a little evolutionary psychologist on people. But if you look at like the most successful polities, the people in history, the one thing that they share in common is like a very long history of literacy and value on education. So if you look at Chinese folk, basically, I think they're one of the longest serving literate polities on the planet. I think they've had like a decent amount of like literacy since like for like 2,500 or 3,000 years. When you look at Jewish folk, it was common practice to practice literacy for the better part of 3,000 years. Even when you look at Europeans, who are now supposed to be based off of like the left-wing perspective, the people who dominate the world and all that kind of bullshit, we have about 500 years of active literacy and education being an incredibly important, emphasized part of culture.
That's not so like Jewish people have been literate among illiterate populations for millennia. That is true. Written language in Europe dates all the way back to the Roman conquest of Western Europe.
Right.
And Eastern Europe, by the way, has been literate for only a couple of centuries because the Romans geographically couldn't invade Eastern Europe in the same way. So the gift of literacy and written language that advantaged Western Europe even over Eastern Europe came from the Roman conquest, which is it dates back further than 500 years. Like the Roman Empire fell whenever it fell. I don't know.
Yeah, I was just more thinking of like whether or not like medieval peasantry could read. You know what I'm saying? Like obviously there's like the higher level culture and the aristocrats who are able to educate themselves. I was just meaning like broad based literacy. Like I think the Chinese history is better than us in this regard, where they did view like public education as more of like a civic right than maybe like medieval Europe. But at the same time, like so that's kind of my point is that if you look at the microcosm, like if you look at like an 8-year study or whatever, and you're not seeing the effects that you want, then that's not surprising to me. Because for me, from like a policy standpoint or like a human evolutionary standpoint, not that I think anything's changed genetically, I'm just talking about like cultural evolution, like that 8 years is a fucking nanosecond. Whereas if you look at the historical history of like Black America, where they brought over from 1619 to 1865 slavery, the Civil Rights Act in 1965, there was probably still some cultural holdovers of like bigotry and racism in the culture, maybe not legalistically, but in the culture. And then a whole bunch of maybe I don't care what you call it, the drug war and the welfare system, perverse incentive programs where they disproportionately affected Black Americans, then looking at like an 8-year fucking program for early childhood fucking intervention for education is a fucking nanosecond when it comes to development. And not only that, but also here's the other fucking thing about it is like, so looking at those educational advantages being lost by the 3rd grade, I would ask why. And my suspicion, because I worked in the education system, my suspicion would be that when you have class sizes that are more than 20 students, when you have disruptive students who don't value education, when you're unable to follow up with educational assignments, when you're unable to emphasize the importance of education on the home front, when parents are single parents and they're working 40 to 60-hour weeks in order to put food on the table, and they can't follow up with their own kids in order to make sure they're doing well, this creates like a negative feedback loop where even if they're spending 8 hours a day for 5 days a week, fucking 3 to 5 in order to get an educational advantage, that is going to be reversed the second they hit I'm being a little bit abrasive with my language, but like the general population where more of these problems come into play. And my problem is like when it comes to this conversation, it can feel like we're focusing on who to blame for the fucking problem rather than how do we fix the fucking problem. And that's kind of where I get a little bit frustrated.
I mean, like you could say 8 years in terms of world history is a small period of time, sure, but the point of starting Head Start and checking on these students was to see if these were enduring advantages, because that was the case made politically for these programs. And it's not that like these people fall behind, it's just that they be like once it's 3rd grade, the students are on the same level, which means that the universal pre-K was not that necessary. And again, we have states that have already had universal pre-K programs for over a decade, maybe 2 decades. And these aren't like the leaders among our nation in educated or producing professionals. They're not even at the top. Like it would be interesting if we could measure how much ahead of everybody else they are, but they're not even ahead. They're not the top schools. Like So pre-K, universal pre-K sounds like a great idea. We understand that there is in early childhood development, like, mental stimulation is valuable, but adding another year in a public education system is not likely to be the solution. Conversely, when we see underperforming kids go to certain charter schools, they start to score among the top in their state. Like that's what we've seen in Newark. Like we had like in Newark, New Jersey, like these schools kept failing no matter what they tried. Then they start letting these kids go by lottery to other schools, and all of a sudden they start performing at the level of the richest kids in public schools in the state of New Jersey, and we've seen this repeated in Harlem. So like, but those schools have a completely different approach. Like they make you dress up, they don't tolerate bad disciplinary infractions, and they expect success from students. They don't teach them to be victimized.
Yeah, so actually, I think we agree here again. But I want to talk about charter schools, and then I want to talk about the program. So, all right. So, when it comes to the elementary school program or the advocacy for universal pre-K or high quality education, regardless of where you are in the United States of America, I don't think we should be comparing kids who literally just got are probably coming from, let's face it, socioeconomic disadvantaged locations. And then they get, a decade and a half of preschool, and we're like, oh, why aren't they competing with like the kids of Ivy League, parents? That's obviously not going to happen. We shouldn't be comparing them to the top tier educational facilities. We should be comparing them to themselves. So did we improve like early childhood outcomes? Did we improve our middle schools? Did we improve our high schools? Is literacy going up? Is standardized testing going up? They should be compared to themselves and no one else. Kind of like,
but I'm not comparing them to like private schools or anything like that. Mm-hmm. I'm saying like I believe Georgia is one of the states that has had universal pre-K for like 15 years, right? Mm-hmm. If Georgia's high school students, they're public high school students, are not outperforming what's a state? I think South Carolina is right above Georgia. Mm-hmm. They're not outperforming South Carolinians, or they're not outperforming Floridians, right, just south of them. When they have no such program, then like we can't like we're doing this because we feel good and we hope it works, even though the evidence shows that it doesn't work.
Like, yeah, but okay, but this is where we wouldn't be looking at like a single factor, and like I don't want to get trapped up, make the mistake of getting trapped up on where we disagree versus where we agree. So I'll move on in a second. But basically, what I would say is like you look at the history of Georgia. I mean, Georgia, like what don't they have like double or triple the black population of the average state, the average state in the United States of America?
You can compare black people in Florida to black people in Georgia, if like that's what you're trying to compare to. Like I was just saying, like if within the same school they're all caught up by third grade, and mm-hmm. we don't see these student populations, and I just gave Georgia because I don't fully remember the state. I want to say it's Georgia, but I haven't looked at like universal pre-K as an issue in a while. So I'm just asserting that maybe it's Georgia, but like they're not outperforming the other kids in their same school by the time they get to third grade. Like the advantage is gone. The head start is over.
Right, but but here's the thing. So if you're talking about like they're not the Head Start is just like this thing that we're kind of throwing a bone to kids who can't afford private school or tutoring or anything like that. Excuse me, I gotta sneeze. Excuse me. I would not expect
COVID on stream.
Oh god damn it! But I wouldn't expect these kids to do better than their peers if their peers are in better socioeconomic conditions. I wouldn't expect them to do better if the other kids are able to go to like Sunday school, or they have parents that read to them on a daily basis. So, for instance,
I just want to point out, like you bring up socioeconomic status, like we see students outperform other students in the same exact schools. Like the idea that your socioeconomic status is determining how you're performing in education is not true. We have students in the same family, like siblings, that don't perform the same way. We
agree like, here. Because so for instance, like as a commingling factor or whatever, like I'm pretty sure they can take a look at like how many hours a week do you read as being like one of the major variables that impact how well you do on standardized tests. Like it's actually like obviously these things can be like correlative, causative. There's a lot of noise in the data and like all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, my mother was an educator at a charter school. And as a result, she basically took people who were in these kind of straits. And this is where I guess I want to move to where we agree. I don't care how we get there, right? Like I don't care if it's high quality universal pre-K, school choice, universal education, high quality this, high quality that, secondary education to subsidize what. I don't give a shit how we get there. What I do want to do though is I want to look at breaking these chains of like intergenerational poverty, and I'll try to be quick, but I want to share an example with you. There were at least so I also worked in the schools as a school resource officer for my last year of school. And basically there were kids and I also worked at a charter school as well. And there were kids who were coming in who were fucking brilliant, but they came from shitty families. And as a result, when they at 10 or 13, they were doing well at 10, but they were told by their parents, hey, education isn't important. It's time for you to make money for the family. We don't make enough on our own. So you're going to start burglarizing cars and you're going to start selling weed. And so what would happen is these kids, because they basically know that they don't have a future and they know that they have to support their families through being what amounts to career criminals. They go and do these things. They burglarize cars on behalf of their family. That's a felony. They sell marijuana. Oftentimes they'll get caught with a felony possession amount. So then they catch a felony. They now their options are work at Taco Bell or be a drug dealer. And most of them pick a drug dealer because being a drug dealer is more lucrative than working at Taco Bell. And so this is where I'm saying, like, these kids, or some of these kids, don't have a shot, and then they become a problem for the society. Whereas if you had like mentoring programs, intervention, all that kind of stuff, you wouldn't be seeing hopefully you could break a few of them out of this like intergenerational criminal cycle. And we did that with greater and lesser effect depending on the kid and depending on the family. But that's just one of the things that I saw.
I mean, I like obviously I can't like refute your specific like anecdotal experience. Some people are saying you mean crack instead of weed because there's not a large population of people going to prison for weed. But you did say it was enough to be a felony trafficking. So like everybody calm down in the chat.
They're dealing, and it's Florida, and it's still criminal in Florida without a medicinal license.
Sure, but like that's not a huge proportion of why people are in prison. Like,
sure,
like people aren't being like thrown into prison for long terms for marijuana. Overwhelmingly, it's violent crime that is higher, which is causing that. But I understand that you can have limitations, and I understand that. This is like I'm using this term from Thomas Sowell because I think it's important. This is what's called a cosmic injustice, right? It is not your fault if you're born into a single parent household. It's not your fault if you're born to a drug addicted parent. We all understand that. The question is, what do we do? Like, do we cause current day injustices today in order to address these cosmic injustices because they make us feel better? Or do we expect people to overcome this or try to incentivize as much as possible for people to stay in stable families to kind of undercut some of the root causes of this? Like, there's a lot of like externalization of problems. Like, ultimately, you still are responsible for your own decisions no matter where you came from. And I don't say this out of nowhere. Like, my great grandfather was murdered by his neighbors in Puerto Rico when my grandmother was a child. Right? My grandmother became a drug addict. Her husband killed himself when my mother was 13. Right? Like, my mom and her sister had every single reason to go down a similar path as my grandmother. They didn't want to do that. They saw like what her life had become, how she wasted it, and they broke out of it. They applied to a high school in New York City. They still have them where they could have a trade by the time that they graduated, and then they went to university. But that was decisions that they made for themselves looking back, because you have a moral obligation to see the flaws in your parents and overcome them. Like, I came from a single parent household, so I am making damn sure with my girlfriend as best as possible that when we get married and have children, we stay together for the children. Like, so that somebody said murder for a chicken. It was actually way worse than murder for a chicken, but that's neither here nor there. So, like, it's up to you as an individual to overcome this. And it's like, yeah, you have sad circumstances and all that. Like, my mother, surprisingly, when her dad, like, offed himself, wasn't left any intergenerational wealth. All right. But, like, you have to make moves. You have to be the change for yourself. You can't wait for somebody to come around and help you out with your life.
Yeah, the good news is we agree. So I want to back up to a minor point that you made because I just want to point it out because it's important. I agree with you that people aren't spending a lot of time in jail, even for weed dealing, even for marijuana offenses that are in trafficking amounts. I actually want to say that people don't spend a lot of time in jail or prison for burglary because basically it's such a common crime that they spend like time served a week in jail and then they get kicked back to the street. But then this is part of my problem with the term felony, but also with the way that we deal with justice right now. Is I would actually like to see marijuana legalized because I think it has about as much social harm as alcohol does. With meth and cocaine and those other drugs, I think we should look at the Portuguese model to see whether or not decriminalization while still going after traffickers is a good idea. Okay. The thing that I really don't like about our jail system as it exists right now, or our prison system as it exists right now, is we criminalize a whole bunch of people. We slap them with the term felon. We make it difficult for them not to recidivize. Then we throw them in this like revolving door system where they become like a repeat customer over and over and over again. And to show you how I've used your exact data point in order to punch left, oftentimes lefties will talk about like, oh, we're the most incarcerated society on the planet, and we incarcerate more people per capita than China. And I'm like, okay, would you rather be a political prisoner in China, or would you rather be like, in jail for a DUI and then released like 3 days later on bond? Like these things are not materially comparable. But I do think there is something to be said for like we kind of felony or a felon is too much of a loaded term that hyper limits your opportunities for employment. And it kind of, we have a recidivism problem in the United States. I don't know if you disagree with that or not. Then what I would say is we agree here where from an individualist analysis, like I'm a communitarian, which basically means that there's collectivism and there's individualism. I think individualism is a hyper positive way to analyze society for yourself and also as advice. You should always give advice to individuals. You should analyze your life as an individual. But I think when we're talking about societies, the danger of collectivism is we kind of have this like very passive, very externalized perspective on problems, and we don't ever want to blame the individual for the way that they interact with society. We just want to externalize it to the collective and never hold anybody accountable. Communitarianism, I think, is like the even split between these two ideas, where it's basically viewed as a feedback loop between the individual and the community. So while I think that, let's say that some young black kid or just young kid, Hispanic kid, white kid, or whatever, who was born to a shitty circumstance was asking me for advice, I think that I should give him individualistic advice. But if I was to advocate for policy that would enable his success, I would do that at the community or collective level. And I think the part of what we're talking past here, or the reason why we're talking past each other, is because the nefarious collectivists say it's not your fault, it's society's fault. But the smarter people are saying like, we should optimize society to make sure that individuals are able to make the best decisions possible.
Yeah, and look, I understand that, but I would say that you're a part of the people who are saying it's not their fault. Just listen to the language you use when you describe it. You talk about people becoming criminalized instead of people breaking the law, which is what they do. And by the way, I'll go further than you. Decriminalization to me, it's like nonsense. Legalize it. Slap an age limit on it. It's fine. It's not a big deal. I'm like so over this. Like go after the traffickers. It's such an anti-capitalist nonsense. Like, oh, the people who are selling it are somehow more evil, but the customers that are consuming it, who are causing the demand for the selling, they're totally fine. But these people are actively engaging in these problems, and the idea that the drug war is like tilted in this racial way, it's again, it's not built on anything fact based. Like I've gone over most of these myths on my channel before. First of all, one of the number one drugs, and nobody ever talks about that, was the premise for the drug war, was amphetamines. because college kids were using stimulants in order to improve their performance, and that's what the Nixon administration wanted to go after. This is what parent groups were complaining about because this was the drug that college kids were using. I mean, Mickey Mantle very famously ended up getting a staph infection when he was trying to pursue Babe Ruth's home run record the same year that Roger Maris broke it, because he got injected by a doctor that had treated John F. Kennedy, and he was just shooting people up with a bunch of amphetamines, and he called it his secret formula. This is how popular and normal it was in the United States in the lead up to the drug war. But people don't talk about that because they're like, oh, marijuana, here's some paperwork related to marijuana. And this guy who kind of quoted Nixon, but he didn't quote him at the time, he quoted him 35 years later, and here's what he thought and all this. Like, so the idea that the drug war, it's like, if you know it's illegal, you understand that there are problems, like, and there are problems beyond just the moving and using of drugs that relate to the punishments of certain drugs, like violence, and you're participating in that, you're not being criminalized. You are becoming a criminal. You're making a choice. And you talk about like the detrimental impacts that this has on society. I would argue that letting all these violent felons who are so short-sighted that they choose selling drugs and like fighting over territory, that is damaging the community. This is a small portion of the population, and not removing them drives down the property values of these areas. It raises insurance costs. It's the reason why these people end up paying more for the same goods in a better neighborhood for a lower crime rate, because the cost of doing business is significantly higher.
Yeah, but we don't even do a good job of that. This is actually one of my frustrations with it. So it's interesting. I had a question, but I'll move past it for now. So I agree with the fact that if there's somebody who's committing violence and making awful fucking short-term consequences, they have to be dealt with accordingly. But I think that morally, we're coming at it from like two different like moral axiomatic positions, and I'm actually sympathizing with a position that I don't even agree with. So a lot of smart people, including Destiny, are determinists. They're like cosmic determinists. They think that the universe is it's set up the way that it is. Variables bump into each other. We might have the illusion of choice. But ultimately, like, choice itself is it's a matter of illusion, and really the variables that you use in order to evaluate decisions are already they're already created by previous decisions. But what I would say is that conceptualizing yourself as an agent and conceptualizing yourself as having free will, while maybe not cosmically true, can create a checking mechanism in your brain for you to double check all of your choices and to analyze the consequences of all of your choices. Because if you're just like a cosmic mistake that's bouncing off the variables of the world, and that's a foundational belief that you have, then that's gonna affect your choices regardless of whether or not you have free will. You're just gonna say, oh, I'm a cosmic agent, random shit fucking doesn't matter, like I don't even really control my choices anyways, I pick option A. Whereas if you're kind of like a free will advocate and you think that you have choices and your choices have consequences and what you're going to do matters, then you're going to take a longer time in order to evaluate what you're doing and the consequences thereof. So that's where, for me, the moral sin, because oftentimes with like collectivists or determinists, they view punishing, and like actually I'm really happy you brought this shit up because it drives me fucking crazy. The moral problem with like determinists is that they think that if you punish somebody who was going to do something but they don't have any real say in how they control themselves anyways, then that's kind of like a moral wrong in and of itself. But if you're a centrist like me, then you say no. You optimize the society so the most amount of people can make the correct choices, but then for the people who make the negative choices, you throw a fucking brick at their head. You throw the fucking book at them, and that's kind of how I'm able to sleep at night, is if we have a society that's optimized for education and good outcomes and family and good economic opportunities and all that kind of stuff, then when somebody steps out of line, you can basically go after them with the full force of the law. Whereas if you if they have cosmic injustices that create them as a risk variable, there's perverse incentive and structures inside the society that reinforce those negative choices. They make those negative choices and then you destroy them. Then there's something incorrect morally going on there.
Well, again, like, the reason I use the term cosmic injustice is because it happened before. Like, obviously, past past issues can lead to present issues. We all understand that. It's how linear time works. As far as like determinism versus free will, like I agree that we should operate under the premise that we have free will because that's like the only way that you can form a society or have a social contract and all that. But yeah, I think like fundamentally the issue that I have is like before we get to solutions, we have to agree on the problem and what the source of the problem is. And largely from what I see, the problem of underachievement comes from the source, which is the underachievers. It's something they need to correct about themselves. And that's at an individual level and ultimately at a group level when you have a culture that doesn't value the things that lead to success. I mean, again, you can't not emulate successful groups and then expect the same success as those groups. Like it doesn't make any sense. And we've seen this happen and it worked before. Scottish people lagged behind English people for a long time. You had a bunch of illiteracy running rampant in Scotland. Then some guy, I forget who it was, told people in Scotland that they needed to learn to read in order to read the Bible and understand that. Couple of generations later, Scots are like the founders of the Enlightenment. Adam Smith, I believe John Locke, or John Stuart Mill, I believe. Like these are all like Scottish thinkers that like they didn't produce anything in terms of like long-term literary work, but they learned English because English was the dominant language, and that's where the vast number of like things that you could learn to read, like the backlog of scholarship was. They made changes within their own culture, and now like I mean, we still consider Scots drunks, but other than that, like they're quite successful in the world.
Oh yeah, like I'm Irish, so I come from a bunch of like degenerate fucking alcoholic, like bog dwelling fucking potato eaters. So yeah, I understand. But like, so I do have a question that I do want to get to, and then I want to make a point after that. So I guess based off of hearing some of your rhetoric about like charter schools, school choice, legalization, all that kind of stuff. A lot of these ideas would like firmly root you, at least in my perspective, in like the libertarian camp. Is that how you self-identify? Like, do you have like a minimal statism that you think should be implemented?
I'm mostly a libertarian, and a libertarian is not to be confused with an ANCAP or even a minarchist. I wouldn't even call myself a minarchist. A libertarian, which is small government.
Okay, so like a minimum amount of government in order to provide essential functions, but after that, like people should primarily be their own advocates in their affairs.
Right.
Okay. All right. Cool. So I just wanted to get that kind of out loud and on the record, so like people can understand like where you're coming from philosophically. So the reason why there's something I brought this up earlier today, actually with Destiny specifically, and I think he felt the same way that you did. That you have to agree on descriptions before you even can get to prescriptions, because anybody who has different descriptions is going to result in different prescriptions. But what I think is interesting is that like out of the four of you in the room, while the education thing, like I don't think I've like sold you on my educational ideas, but at the same time, out of the four of you in that room for that debate, there was three people who agreed on education. Fanatic, Destiny, and Lauren would have agreed on education. And then as far as like how to change the war on drugs, whether it's like decriminalization or legalization of drugs or whatever, there was 4 out of 4 who would agree at least with decriminalization, and there might have been 1 or 2 who were for legalization. And this is kind of I bring all of this up is because like we're fighting over descriptive points, which have value, and we need to understand where other people are coming from and all that kind of stuff. But if y'all were the democratic representatives of our society, we could have literally passed education reform and completely revolutionized the war on drugs, even though you viscerally disagree on descriptions. And this is something that I'm trying to point out to the audience is you don't have to like, you don't have to agree with, you don't have to be friends with people that you work with in order to advocate policy. And I feel like, especially on the twitch.tv debate space or whatever, people feel like they need to like you. They feel like they need to understand your politics and agree with it 100%. They need to understand and agree with your descriptions, and they need to understand your prescriptions as well. And that's just not the case. We can forward culturally while still viscerally disagreeing on things. And that's something that I wanted to point out.
Yeah, I mean the thing is like I don't know. Like, I don't know how far that actually goes, because
Mm.
everybody's going to say that they're in favor of education, but like what, or everybody should have a quality education. That will generally poll really well across the country and all
Mm.
that. But like what that actually means, like, yeah, you can get people to agree on broad topics, but like what it actually means depends on what you're bringing to the table. Like, what's the foundation of the reason you believe that? Like, you and I will fundamentally probably agree that families are important, and I mean, I would hope that like you understand that two-parent households are incredibly important.
Mhm.
But like the cause of single-parent households in like certain communities, like we might fundamentally disagree on. And since we fundamentally disagree on that, then we're going to end up disagreeing on how to address it. Like,
Yeah, and there's certain since you're a libertarian, I'm going to appeal to your sense of like state responsibilities versus cultural responsibilities as far as like how we achieve our goals. Because I think I'm more liberal or libertarian in this thing as well. I think when it comes to like cultural issues, we have to advocate on the cultural level, and I think when it comes to like legal issues, we have to advocate at the state level. You might not agree with me that like education is a purview of the state or that it should be expanded or anything like that. But at the same time, that would be my argument, is that it is a state affair. The education of the next generation is a collective responsibility. It is something that should be optimized through the arm of the state, through taxes and all that kind of stuff. But while we might not agree on that necessarily, what we probably could agree on is, the Bush No Child Left Behind was an incredibly unpopular policy that was lambasted at the time, particularly by the left. And NPR actually did a post hoc evaluation of No Child Left Behind. And what they found is that because kids were or families were better able to make educational decisions, because they were able to move away from toxic districts, because they were able to basically use standardized testing to evaluate administrations that were underperforming, they were able to break up toxic administrations that were basically not doing their jobs. And as a result of that, like educational achievement for a majority of the schools had actually gone up quite significantly. And so that's kind of the thing where it's like, we don't have to have like your 100% solution. We should be kind of like implementing all of these solutions, and we should do so by fighting. But when we spend, and by the way, like I don't care. I'm on twitch.tv. I'll fight about anything. But at the same time, when we spend like 2 hours arguing whether or not systemic racism is the appropriate term for, varying results by demographics or something like that, we can't even get to prescriptions. We can't even get to where we disagree on prescriptions because we're so busy calling each other racist assholes. And I do blame the left for that, by the way.
I don't care about the term. It's just the idea, the great fallacy that absent discrimination, we would see equality or even similar outcome between racial groups, ethnic groups, religious groups. I don't think that's based on anything. Like we've never in world history have we seen equal outcome. So like that's the problem. So it's not about whether you call it systemically racist or whatever. Like that's part of like the guilt trip, so you don't actually look into people's actual responsibility for their own behavior. Like I don't care, you could call it something else, but the fundamental problem is that disparities in outcome are to be expected. It's what we see everywhere in the world. There are a number of reasons for disparities in outcome. Geography, like geography, climate, cultural norms. There's all these different things that lead to unequal outcomes. So why would we expect that, let alone put a label on it, let alone try to correct it?
Okay, so why would we put a label on it and why would we try to correct it? I think the reason why we would put a label on it is because this affects people's lives. Whether you're talking about like broken families, single parent families, disproportionate economic outcomes, the drugs affecting families, like all this kind of stuff. All of this does matter. So the disparate incomes are not like, just statistics on a piece of paper. They're actually representative of human lives that are having better and worse lives through a multivariate analysis. Also, I think the reason why we would bring it up as a problem is because these things could be optimized. And maybe this is naive of me to think so, but I look at governance and I look at the way that institutions are created and the way that they work, especially even looking at the military, right? What you do is you set an ideal. You create an institution in order to try to fulfill that ideal. It horrifically fails at achieving that ideal because when you're dealing with people and logistics and money and power and administration, people are people. They're going to fuck it up, right? but you don't use people fucking up their endeavors or their ideals as an excuse to say, it is what it is. You use that as a continually improving process in order to evaluate the system and to evaluate the inputs and outputs and say, how do we make this better? And this is kind of my
fundamentally, why is equality of outcome an ideal? It's not for me. Like, why is it for you?
It's not. I actually don't think that we would ever achieve the quality of outcome. I think we would. I think we could.
So what's the problem? You said that disparities between groups are a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so you're using outcome to measure the problem. So why would the ideal be to, like, do you not get why I'm assuming that you're claiming for equality of outcome between groups, at least, not between individuals?
Yeah, because I think these systems can be optimized, right? Let's say that there's something that we fundamentally can't fix, right? I'll be a honky and I'll use gangster culture as like a variable that would affect us optimizing the system. And by the way, like I'm saying it like I'm saying it kind of haphazardly, but this is real. There are some families that are career-long criminals. They literally view they view criminality as a vocation. They view passing on skills to their kids in how to be criminals as their kids' vocation. So those people are not necessarily going to be affected by us optimizing the institutions that we currently have, right? They're going to say, fuck you, fuck your institutions. I don't want any part of it. You've treated me like shit for 400 years or whatever. I don't want to participate.
I hate to interrupt you in the middle of a point, but like I've read multiple different interviews from prisoners, hardcore criminals. Mm-hmm. Most of them don't want their children to turn out like them. So the idea that they're like training their children to do these things, I think like maybe in some slim cases, but overall, most of them don't want their children to turn out like them. No matter like how many murders they've been convicted of, like even if they're in a gang or anything like that, like there's still people who want their kids to do better than they did, and they even if they can't correct their own behavior, they understand that behavior needs to be corrected, and they want better for their children. So like the idea that we're watching generation train generation to train generation, maybe in like a mafia movie or like in the actual mob, sure, but like. No. What ends up happening is that absent male role models, or when all your male role models are criminals, children emulate that behavior. And then we, like as external observers, because like you're a cop, like I haven't committed a crime in at least 8 days. Like we pretend like that's like normal behavior, and we're like, I wonder, like we see somebody rob somebody else and we're like, I wonder what his childhood was like.
Oh, I know.
I wonder what his home life was like. And it's like, no, like that person has transgressed against our society. We have to remove that person. We need to stop being so sympathetic to the individual criminals, because in reality, like there's not a lot we can do in terms of rehabilitation. Like I've went over the research, I've looked into it. It's not something I'm happy about. I would love, everybody's in favor of rehabilitation. I'm the same, but in reality, like our rehabilitative programs are sadly depressing in their ability to succeed. James Q. Wilson has written lengthily about like what the limits are of what we can do. The thing that we can do is remove repeated bad actors from our society to reduce harm on the people that get victimized by them. And James Q. Wilson, like when they finally started implementing his ideas of criminal justice reform and not the ideas of the intelligentsia that wanted to like arrest poverty because poverty's behind all of these crimes, we started to actually see crime go down. So I'm for what's effective. If we have an effective rehabilitative means, I'm fine to try until we get an effective rehabilitation system. But like the idea that like we can do that now and it's just a choice that we're making, that we're not making, is ridiculous. The idea that even criminals don't know that they're committing crimes, that they don't want better for their children, is also ridiculous.
Okay, nothing you said really affects anything I was going to say. So I think the vast majority of people, if you optimized institutions and you got their buy-in and all that kind of stuff, they would want better for their kids. I think there is a marginal fraction of the population that is not going to want to participate in that project. Okay, so we kind of agree there. And then I know that you're saying like, I don't want to say ridiculous because I don't think you use that term. But it's silly to insinuate that generations are training other generations in order to become criminal. This is not borne out by what's happening in the in reality. What's happening in reality is that there are generational shifts within the kids, and I do this because I literally saw it as it came about. What happens is when you're 0 to 10, you want to be a cop. When you're 10, you find out that your lot in life is for everything to suck. So you start burglarizing cars and you start basically dealing weed because your family is encouraging you to do so in order to gain additional income. You catch a felony, you know that you're not going anywhere employment-wise, so you say, fuck it, I'm going to double down on being a criminal, and then you deal harder and you basically climb up in the drug ranks. By the time that you're 18, this is already filtered down. By the way, this is a filtering system. 90% of kids don't participate in the system, and out of the 10% of kids that do participate in this system, that like only 10% of them remain into adulthood. And what happens once you become an adult, because you can no longer stab or murder or whatever as aggressively as you could as a teenager because you're no longer a part of the juvenile system, you basically either move into the leadership of the drug cartel or you fucking quit. And those are really the two options. And then the leaders, the people who continue to deal drugs into their 20s, 30s, they're basically the people who are doing the hands-on, major packages, major deals, major this, major that. But they have a higher sense of risk, even if they're lieutenants, because they will take on like the homicides and the power plays and all that kind of stuff. Then there's an entire other generation of people who are in like 40s and 50s or whatever. This is at least the experience with the drug cartel that I was working with in my town. And the people in their 40s and 50s, they organize the the crime syndicate, but they do not touch drugs. They do not touch guns. They literally advise the lieutenants to advise the teenagers on how to operate burglary and theft rings and drug rings. This is like, I guarantee you, if there was like an anthropological study, you could literally see kids as they come up from like 0 years old to 10. What happens at 10 to 20, 30, 40, 50? I guarantee you this would be borne out anthropologically.
I mean, of course, don't mistake me. I was saying it's ridiculous, the idea that parents overall, broadly, because even criminal parents don't want their children to become criminals. But obviously, the older generation of criminals is recruiting the younger generation to be gang members and foot soldiers. Everybody understands that. But the problem I have is that these are like, the poverty isn't causing that. This type of behavior is driving the poverty. Like, we've seen poorer black people, poorer groups, or poorer periods in the United States of America, any way you want to slice it, have lower homicide rates, lower burglary rates. We see people at the same levels of poverty and not participating in the same levels of criminality. Like, this is not something that again, poverty as a root cause is a fool's errand. It's not the root cause of these problems. You have cultural causes. We have a bunch of poor people in the United States. And when I say poor, I have to put that in air quotes because our poverty line literally is what qualifies your nation to be a wealthy nation. It's around $12,000 for individuals. So poverty's not driving this. Like, that's not what this crime is about. They're not stealing because they need bread for their family. But their stealing is negatively impacting other people's way of making a living, raising prices for other people in that neighborhood, and that is reducing investment in that neighborhood, which is creating a bunch of other problems, which is why you have to go in and get these bad actors off the streets. Like, they are the source of these problems that other people have to deal with. If you want to know why there's no jobs in these areas, it's not because of historical discrimination that in no way, shape, or form correlates with unemployment. It's because they are making these areas not good for investment. Like, and we just saw like a bunch of riots that happened, and we're like, oh my god, look at the $2 billion in damages in all these different places around the country. The $2 billion in damages, that's quick. That's what happened in like the 90 days, the 100 days. What is really important to look at is the 10 years of recovery just to get back to the point you were before the rioting that we saw in LA after the LA riots, the insurance rates that all these people have to pay going forward, the higher costs of prices that they have to pay because some stores just won't operate in there and there'll be less competition. Like, the criminals are driving the poverty, not the other way around.
Okay. Well, I'm neither here nor there. So, for instance, like I know poverty is not like it might like be like a correlative factor with crime, but it's not necessarily an indicator or a predictor. And then also I know that like I want to say like income inequality is like a higher predictor for crime than it is like poverty itself, which is weird. But
That's also not true. Like I've heard this asserted over and over again. So income inequality has grown since 1980. Like, are we disputing that, or are we not disputing that? It's
I
grown significantly. It
okay,
grew in the 1990s, right?
sure,
And it grew in the 2000s, right? Great
sure.
Recession and all that. So income inequality has been growing, and we saw crime fall from 1994 all the way, even through the recession, crime continued to fall. So like an
But
increase in
this is.
poverty and an increase in inequality,
Mhm.
and we don't see an increase in crime. And by the way, and then we move on and we start seeing a spike after the Black Lives Matter riots. We'll see the economy recover, and because reforms to police that are detrimental to these neighborhoods where the crime is happening have been set in place, even as the economy recovers, we will see rises in crime. We've seen rises in crime as incomes have
Okay,
risen,
can
as
I?
incomes have fallen. All manner of things with income inequality are not predictors of crime.
Okay, can I interject here? So basically, I want to say that between like 1990 and like 2020, we saw like a 50% drop in violent crime across the globe almost. So, basically, what I would be saying is that like we're not looking at poverty as like I never do a monovariable analysis where I'm looking at a single factor about whether or not it does something. So for instance, like people who are like, "Oh, guns predict homicide" or some shit like that, and it's like, nah, there's like 18,000 fucking variables that go into fucking violence. Gun is one of them. The reason why you're fixating on it is because it's the most obvious one, right? Like I want to say like Swiss gun ownership and the way that they own guns and do gun control and all that kind of stuff. They have one of the highest like gun ownership rates on the fucking planet, but they don't have the kind of violence that we do. There's a whole bunch of factors for why that's real. So I would never look at like the drop in poverty or this, that, the other, or whatever. I already conceded like 70% of what you said, by the way. But the thing that I would say is if you've seen like a 50% drop in overall crime over the course of 30 years and income inequality has increased, that doesn't eliminate it as a factor in people's behavior. It just means that there's other variables that are ongoing. So for instance, this is my personal hypothesis. I have no data to back it up. But I do think that like video games, entertainment, increases in like medical care, and also there was one other factor that I'm kind of blanking on right now. But I know for a fact that one of the things that's controlling the homicide rate is improvements in emergency medical care. I also personally postulate, this is a personal assessment, is that like video games and entertainment have become so ubiquitous that it's very easy for teenagers and young adults, people who are typically the ones who are doing shenanigans, getting into trouble and committing violent crime. It's so easy for them to get home, light a fucking blunt, and play the PS2 instead of going out and fucking physically fighting each other. That is probably a contributory factor for people chilling the fuck out when it comes to violence.
I mean, look, have we improved medical care? Sure.
Mm-hmm.
But 1,800 people used to get murdered in New York City, where I live, a year.
Mm-hmm.
300 people became the norm just a few years ago. A large portion of that is not better medical care saving 1,500 people a year.
Mm-hmm.
It's changes and the NYPD is one of the most data-driven police forces that we have. It's changes in policing or a more serious overall cultural attitude about crime, because we did see when
But
attitudes
this.
shifted, crime went up in not just the United States but in Europe, which by the way is an undercutting position to the idea that systemic racism is driving crime, because we saw crime go up in all these European countries at the same time. By the way, when wealth was going up, by the way, during the same periods of time in the 60s and the 70s where people talked about how the post-depression economy was so great for the United States. It's the 60s income distribution. So we had incomes going up, and income distribution was more towards what the left is saying that they like. It wasn't as unequal. Like, the reason I'm isolating each of these individual factors is because this is how you determine whether or not
Yeah.
this is what's actually driving crime.
But
So if I
can you
point
think
to
of
one of the greatest expansions of income inequality after you assert that is driving crime, and it also coincides with one of the greatest drops in crime in the history of this country, then you can't say, oh, well, there was probably another factor at the same time. Like,
yeah, okay, no, there's absolutely...
you would have to say that...
No. Okay, listen, I know we've been really pleasant so far, but, like, you can't tell me that there isn't, like, a fundamental fucking historic variable that happened in the 1960s and 1970s that you can't think of that absolutely changed law enforcement fundamentally for the entire world. You also can't tell me that income inequality only started in the 90s when basically like the 70s through the 80s was
I didn't. It said it got worse in the 90s.
Sure.
Right? And you were saying that inequality drives crime. So if it gets worse, if it's like one of the biggest expansions of inequality, like the regressives tell me nonstop about this inequality and how we have to worry about it. If that's the thing that's driving crime, why would that coincide with one of the greatest crime drops in history?
Okay.
Also, if your thing is the drug war is what caused this, that, or the other, then let me know when in the 90s we started undoing the drug war. Because I remember in the 90s, we started getting more serious about enforcing it, and we saw a drop in crime. So the idea that, and I've heard all of these different excuses that we just made more things illegal, that's what caused the law. We still make more things illegal to this day.
Okay, you're asking questions, but you're continuing as well. So okay, so what this would be my assertion is that during the 60s and 70s, as an external factor to violence and crime, drugs became professionalized. People became manufacturing drugs. Drug cartels came up. They realized it was a really good way to make money. And basically, law enforcement was a step behind the entire time. If you look at the history of the drug war, this is absolutely true. So that would be my posit for why things got so bad. Then also, the crazy left-wing progressive source that is basically telling me that income inequality has something to do with crime is Jordan Peterson. So my supposition, my steel man of that position would not be that if everybody has all of the material needs met, they all have like, food, housing, shelter, good access to education and all that kind of stuff, because there's a billionaire that exists outside of themselves, all of a sudden they're just going to run out and shoot up a liquor store because all their material needs, despite being met, they're just jealous of the billionaire, so they're just going to create violent crime. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, however, is that there probably is a motivator of envy and jealousy between people who are working class, who are on a subsistence income or a less than subsistence income. They're busting their balls 60 to 80 hours a week. They're barely fucking getting by. Then they look at the middle class or the upper class and they say, this motherfucker's working 40 hours a week. He's got a fucking Benz. I fucking work my dick off and I'm not getting anywhere. Fuck that motherfucker. I'm gonna go do some shit in order to get by. I almost guarantee you that if we look psychologically, envy is probably one of the motivators. So like you said, $12,000 on the global stage is one of the things that determines whether or not a country is deemed as rich. And our per capita, nominal income or our per capita income or whatever is what, like 3 times that or something for like median income. So basically, what's the bitch about? You got your fucking McDonald's, you got your PlayStation 2, you got your fucking apartment, you got air conditioning. What's the fucking complaint about? I would posit that envy would be one of the things that motivates people to do it, even if their material needs are being met. So, no, I don't think this is a factor that you can just discount and just say, no, it's not relevant.
I mean, Jordan Peterson is dead wrong. And if envy was the factor, then we wouldn't see the overwhelming majority of crimes being committed against people at the same exact level as the criminal. Like, we're not seeing all these people run into the rich neighborhoods and go beat up the rich people. That happens, but that's rare.
Do you know why?
90% of the time when a black person kills somebody, that's another black person that lives really close to him. Okay, like they're in a similar financial position.
Okay, but
in terms of the idea that like, oh, people are working so hard, 80 hours a week. Hours worked have gone down for everybody except for CEOs and upper management people. Like this idea that like, oh, there's so much more pressures today. People have never had it better than they've had today. Like it's just ridiculous.
Okay, so I already have basically just Googling it for income inequality and unemployment rate increases the positively correlates with the crime rate. I'll go ahead and read the study. I don't want to get into a debunking study, and I know we're wrapping up on the last 10 minutes. But basically what I would say is that's an incredibly simplistic analysis of why people commit crime. Just because the person that they're committing crime against, I'm not saying that they're individually looking at somebody that they're going to rob and they're going to say, that's a piece of shit who has more than me. No, what they're saying is that person has money, guns, or electronics. Hold on, stop. I'm talking.
Your scenario literally was going after somebody working half as long but making more money. That's why I said that.
Okay, stop focusing on the semantics. Listen to what I'm saying. So what I'm saying is The motivation for an individual to rob somebody who's in their peer group is not because they individually hate that person because they have more than them. It's because that person has firearms, electronics, cash, or jewelry that they know that they can turn around and turn into cash almost immediately. And that motivation is not because they're going to do a single burglary or a single theft or a single robbery and then they're going to be set for life. No, this isn't fucking James Bond. This is literally so they can, because we're talking about how like crime impacts communities and makes them unlivable. It's literally so they can go because they're fucking desperate and they hate their fucking lives. So they go get high. They turn these things into cash. And then they go get high in order to forget their shitty fucking lives. And now this might cause, because we already agree on this might cause like a negative spiral effect in which these people are committing crimes in order to do drugs. And then basically that makes their communities worse. And then it makes their communities worse and makes their communities worse and all that kind of shit. What I'm asking is, who gives a fuck about whether or not you're right about the variables or I'm right about the variables if we can evaluate solutions and try to figure out how to break this fucking cycle? You were talking about like, basically parents don't want their kids to be criminals or whatever. Okay, let's create an optimized society from an educational and sociological standpoint. That way the kids of criminals don't end up like their parents. Let's reinforce two-parent households. Let's give people decent income so they feel like they can participate in the economy well. And like the psychological dismissal that you think economics has nothing to do with people's motivation for why they commit crime.
I didn't say that.
Okay, well then
I didn't say economics has nothing to do with it.
Okay.
Also, what do you mean give? What do you mean give people an income? Like who's giving what? You have to earn income.
Sure, you do have to earn income because I'm a mixed economy capitalist. But what I would say is that that income has to be proportional to basically a decent standard of living, and this is probably not something that we agree on.
You have to take jobs and work your way up in order to earn a living.
Sure.
We should stop incentivizing people with no skills to have more kids and live off the government because you're somehow entitled to a living because you exist in the United States.
Yeah, this is unfortunately we are running up on time, and if I was to start debating libertarianism, we would probably both get incredibly frustrated. Because I
never asserted that. That economics has nothing to do with crime. Some crime obviously has to do with economic circumstances. Mm-hmm. But like every time we get into this conversation, I always bring up the crime rate, right? And I always end up asking people, because the arrest poverty crowd, if people rape because they're poor, if they rape because of income inequality. And people say, oh, well, that's just one crime. But rape, like places where there are high rape, heavily correlate with places where there are high rates of murder, where there are high rates of assault and high rates of other crime. So the idea that we're like we should arrest poverty, or like we have to keep externalizing the problem from the people that are committing the crimes because we don't want people to take accountability for committing the crimes. We don't want parents to take accountability for the decisions that they make before they have children and the negative consequences that leaves for the children of those parents. It's ridiculous to me. And I highly recommend that you read James Q. Wilson and just go over every single root cause that you have presented here, because it's all in his book, or his various books. And you'll see these don't hold water under scrutiny. But usually what happens is somebody asserts poverty, no evidence is asked for, and no evidence is given, and then they just move on because we're like, criminals tend to be from poor circumstances sometimes. So I guess it makes sense. Like, you have to look a little deeper in order to find the actual solutions.
Well, here's the thing is, like, I would implement crime is just one of the variables that I'm analyzing. I would still want to implement these solutions regardless of whether or not they solved crime. I don't think you're ever going to solve crime. But I still think that kids should get early access to education because there's a whole bunch of positive benefits of that. I still think that there are plenty of things that you can do for K through 12 education where basically we should figure out why that third grade advantage is disappearing, and we should optimize that school, and we should study the statistics for that when it comes to access to secondary education or vocational training to make sure that people have access to high paying jobs in a competitive economy. I think that should be a part of the government. I don't think that it's that expensive. And oftentimes when I hear fiscal responsibility responsibility arguments about let's be effective with our dollars and cents. It's like, yeah, let's be effective with our dollars and cents when it comes to like education, but let's not be effective with our dollars and cents when it comes to like war. And that's the thing, is like you have to look at the way that the Republican Party, because like I identify as a Republican philosophically, but I loathe the Republican Party. Basically, they'll talk to us about like family and two-parent households and values and conservatism and bootstrapping and all that kind of shit. But then realistically, what do policy-wise? They basically fight Democrats and they cut taxes. And it's like, who the fuck is that helping? So that's kind of where it's like, you know, for me, like the argument is going to be about sociological optimization regardless of outcome, because you should still optimize the society to be as beneficial to as many people as possible.
Right. And I would just say fundamentally, like, again, if Head Start worked, like, you assert that it has these benefits, but the studies literally say it doesn't. If Head Start worked, then I consider being in favor of it. And as for the defense versus education canard, it's ridiculous. Like, we spend more on education because most of the spending is local than we do on defense. And we all should agree, at least to a certain extent, that it is the purview of the national government to provide a national defense. But I don't agree that it's the job of the federal government to provide education. That is a local responsibility. And I don't think funneling money into failing schools, paying them more because they're failing, is a solution. And I think experiment after experiment has proven that out. Like, you talked about where I disagreed with Destiny on education. This was where, because I actually know that in the state of New Jersey, because of the Abbott decisions, they normalized education funding for these failing schools. All that did was subsidize those failing schools. They didn't improve. And a lot of them got worse.
Okay. Then what I would say, because we are running up on time, I'll just shout myself out and then dip if you're okay. But what I would say is we probably agree on 70% of these things. I'm not, I don't think the federal government should be in charge of education, but I do think that some of these things should be optimized. I think dumb fuck asshole kids from the wrong side of the tracks still deserve to have a decent education. So however we achieve that, I don't care. If it's if it's local control, federal funding, if it's I don't care. So basically what I would say is Stephen Q. Wilson, or whatever his first name is, basically
James Q. Wilson would be for criminal justice. I would recommend Charter Schools and Their Enemies about education as a book.
Cool. Then literally I'll jump those on audio or audible.com, and I'll do a 1.75 speed, and I'll blaze through those, and then I'll tell you what I think. But yeah, no, I appreciate you having me on. I'm sorry if we got a little bit contentious there towards the end, but thank you for the conversation. I do appreciate it.
I'm happy to have you on. I have been watching your debates, and I've enjoyed a bunch of your debates. I know we back and forth on this, but I do think it's, like, when you have disagreements, you have to go over the disagreements. He has Counterpoints on YouTube. I believe the stream software copied my old description, but by the time this video ends, I will have his channel and his Twitter linked in the description. But Counterpoints, it's not that hard. Counter and then points, one word. Come on, guys. Go over, give him a subscribe. You see him do debates against lefties all the time. It's interesting stuff. He's on Twitter, too. I actually don't see you tweet a lot on Twitter, but I'm sure it's interesting, too.
but like, okay, but what I would say real quickly is I might have sounded like a filthy communist compared to what you're used to, AJW's audience. But what I would say is that if you do want to see me punch lefties a little bit and kind of rile them up, and also get riled up myself, then basically the panel shows that I do, you'll see some of my more centrist credentials where I do fight lefties, where they go insane. So. Yeah, buddy. I appreciate you.
And what I will say is, sure, we disagreed a whole bunch on this thing, but here's the thing. A lot of the positions that he had, I held at various points in my life, because fundamentally we do want the same things. We want people to do better overall. Like, he says equal opportunity. You guys know how I feel about that. That's why I always say increase the overall number of opportunities. And like, if he gets these audible books, and like he reads them, and then he's like, oh, I never saw that way. He checks the footnotes and he's like, oh, I never seen this way. Like, I think that is possible that he could come to better solutions. Like, I feel like that's where I am. I've held a lot of these beliefs in the past as well. And like, sorry to get like heated, but like I hear so many different crime arguments. It's hard to deal with.
Weirdly enough, I feel duty bound now I have to read the books, and now I have to see whether or not I develop my arguments, because otherwise I'm just throwing the same arguments at you over and over again without looking at your evidence. And I think that's a terrible way to conduct debate.
Also, discriminations and disparities. I know for a fact the audiobook is great.
Awesome.
By Tom Soul.
Literally, yes, and I'll review this if I need to. If you want to DM it to me, then I absolutely will. I do have to jump onto another show, so I sincerely appreciate you. Appreciate the audience. I hope y'all have an excellent night.
All right. Thank you, Connor.
Yep. Catch y'all.